Okay, so you know how this week we were talking about like buying like one shirt in like eight varieties and then one pair of shorts, eight varieties. So yesterday I went to Uniqlo. Have you heard of Uniqlo?
Yeah,
So I knew you're gonna laugh at that. And we went to shop for Audrey because she wanted a couple items for Japan.
that makes
Uh
more sense.
yeah, yeah. And I ended up loving the clothes there. So this is one of I think seven shirts that I bought. You see it's just a normal white t-shirt.
Yeah.
I bought four tank tops. I bought five pairs of shorts. All
Or
for
different color.
what?
Same color or different color? Shorts.
I got all black.
Yeah. See, I think that's the key that I've done this for the last 15 years or so of my life. And one thing I learned is like, don't get seven different colors of shirts and seven different colors, of bottoms, right?
Yeah.
One of them's got to be constant. Either you're just going to get like white and black shirts, or you're just going to get, black shorts and different color
Yeah,
shirts.
exactly. The scientific method there, we're standardizing a variable. So I'm very happy as of now. So that was like 16 items for like less than $400. It's pretty good, wouldn't
Yeah,
you say?
it makes sense given that you guys were going to Japan.
Yeah,
Uh, Very fitting for Audrey. Now the question is like, can you work out in this apparel, or are you going to change into something different when you go to train?
I can work out in this apparel. This shirt looks a little bit, and this was kind of the point, is it looks a little bit, well, maybe it doesn't look fancy to you, but it's not a like it's a shirt that I could wear to dinner. Like I'm going to brunch with Audrey's mom today. It's her birthday. And I'm wearing this to like a somewhat okay restaurant. So it's appropriate, I think, for it's like polyester, which is probably what you would assume with a place like that. But the answer is that I can both work out in it, uh, as well as see my girlfriend's mom for her birthday in it.
I think that's kind of the whole shtick of like the Lululemon and the brands thereafter, where like, you wear them in the gym, but then they kind of like do a good job, wicking sweat or whatever, and
Yeah,
like stink. So you can kind of like, go to the boardroom and, the gym. And they actually do a pretty good job of that. I
yeah,
gotta say. So that's like kind of been my thing. It's like I'll be on a business call, training, going out to dinner, all with the same clothes.
yeah. I mean, it's an efficient move. It's what I would expect from you.
When totally separate topic to get us away from
Hmm. Hmm.
when did you see my text messages about the whole like long muscle length thing? Was that like last night at midnight or this morning when you got up?
It was during the nighttime.
It's a lot. It's like a lot to see, because sometimes that's like how Tom will text me, where Purvis, where it's like, a bunch of things in a row. And then, as you know, I don't check my messages often. So I'll look back in the morning and it's like 20 presents under the tree kind of thing where you're just like, holy shit, there's a lot to, digest here.
Yeah, it was a lot to take in, but I was able to, I looked at it last night, which is why I think I texted you like gonna look at this in the morning. And this morning when I was on my morning walk getting my morning sun, I was reading it over and it made a lot more sense in the morning
I
than it did
woke up
at
and the
night.
very first thought I had when I woke up was like, oh, I was just talking about like mass, but not.
Yeah, so
I sent it to you like
perfect
really,
segue.
yeah, I sent it to you really late. Just again, I had heard that podcast and I was like, oh, this is, that guy Milo is kind of one of the preeminent people talking about, training up the long muscle lengths.
Yeah.
And it's like these guys are much smarter than I am. Like if I thought of something like that, chances are like they've thought of it too. So and also like I haven't just scoured through the research on long muscle length. It's not where I spend most of my day right now. So to an extent, like I rely on guys like Milo and Eric and, Mass Research Review,
Yeah.
to cover that sort of stuff. And then I might have a thought of like, well, did they consider that? And maybe once in a while, like, they didn't, but I'd be kind of surprised, um, if it wasn't to some extent thought of. But, when I do just kind of like pull up some of the research papers they're talking about, I don't really see it, specifically talked about.
Mhm.
Although, like, they they typically control for effort, like any, like most studies, which, the listener right now is going to have no idea what we're talking about, because this is kind of like there's no context for it. So maybe you could give a little bit of context for
Yeah.
it. And then, also today, as you know, like I keep a note in my phone, kind of for each of the people that I talk to in this capacity, or coaches that I have. And it's definitely been a while since I delved into the Ben Giannis note, so I have plenty of other topics to
Okay.
talk about. And I think in regards to the long muscle length thing that we'll get into here, um, it's something that's interesting to me, and I sort of wonder if we're missing um, just a key component of that. But
Mhm.
also, I think it's important to be clear that it's not something like I've read through every research study on, and that I could speak to to the same extent that someone like Milo would. So maybe that's a person we have on the podcast in the
Yeah.
future, something like that. Because by no means is this like a critique of what they're doing. It's just like, why isn't anyone talking about this? And then the other day I heard him mention it on a podcast, and I was like, yeah, that's kind of like what I've been saying all along. So again, zero context for the listener here. Maybe you can kind of bring them up to speed.
Yes. So, and this was convenient too, because inside of the like questions I had gathered for the podcast, the long versus short muscle length thing comes up in some capacity or another, whether it's like in a more specific exercise or it's more generalized. The most common question that relates to this topic is like, should I only now be doing, stretched exercises, stretch position exercises, which for a majority of people, even if they tried to, that would be very difficult to only ever do, in any just normal gym, it would be very difficult to only do stretch position exercises, especially because when we're talking about long versus short muscle length, we're not talking about range of motion. We're talking about the physiological aspect of the tissue we're training. So the broad scopes topic here is long versus short muscle length training, which basically we can look at as like, okay, if I were to take a muscle in the body and I were to just rip it out of the body and I were to stretch it as much as I could, and then I were to allow it to contract, assuming that it could, what we're really discussing when we talk about the stretch mediated hypertrophy conversation versus short position training is that specific length. So that specific length is distinct from a joint moving through its full range. So let's take, the biceps, for example, which is, a two joint muscle. It's a muscle that crosses the shoulder and the elbow. What we could say is, okay, we could do, a curl variation, just for pushing off resistance profile conversation for a second. We could do, a curl variation, and we could just do it standing, arms are at our sides, and we could just move the elbow through its full range, and that would be one thing. But then we could also do something like a preacher curl, maybe with a cable or something, where our arm was a little bit higher up in front of us. And then as a third variation, we could either do something that's like our arms behind our body or our arms above our head even more, and we could move through the same elbow range. So the elbow range of motion is standardized between all those variations, whether your arm is behind your ass crack or it's above your head. The only difference between those things is the shoulder position. And because the biceps crosses the shoulder, the biceps changes length as a product of the shoulder and the arm moving. So what we're talking about with, muscle length stuff is not only influence of just one joint's range in any sort of motion, but one joint's range in the context of another joint's position. And this really only applies to two joint muscles, because two joint muscles are the only ones that can stretch around two joints. So biceps fall into this category, the long head of the triceps, hamstrings, um, one of the quads, right? So just as sort of an introductory thing, I think it's important to introduce that concept, which is that when we're talking about muscle length, we're talking about a physiologically based thing. We're not talking about an exercise based thing. And when we dive more into the exercise-based thing, we have this, conversation that sort of overlaps with resistance profile, which I would also like to touch on again, despite having talked about it in previous episodes. It looked like you wanted to say something, though.
Yeah, I mean, some of the studies do look at the position they're training the muscle in, that are not biarticular, not two joint muscles. So, for example, like they'll do a leg extension where it's just, reps towards the bottom end of the range, and then reps, that are full range of motion, and reps at the top. And it's not like they
Yeah.
just look at the rectus femoris in that example, the two joint muscle. They'll look at, the other quads as well. So sometimes in the research, when they're talking about long muscle lengths, it isn't just exclusive to the two joint muscles.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah, and from that perspective, I want to make clear that the difference between the two joint and the single joint, conversation is really just with the single joint stuff. You really only look at motion, of the elbow. So in the biceps example, a great example would be like the brachialis, which is the single joint guy that sits underneath of the biceps. That would be something that if you only moved your elbow, you would be looking at its full physiological range. But just this distinction of physiological range versus range of motion. With the single joint guys, I guess it would make sense to say that the physiological range is the same as the full range of the joint. And then in other examples like the biceps or the hamstrings, we have to look at hip position, shoulder position, etc. So we've talked about the resistance profile thing, but I want to say it in a little bit of a different way for anyone who's listened to every episode up to this point, which I guess this would be the 8th or something now. Or 9th, I have no idea. But I think resistance profile is helpful to look at from the perspective of just simply like, where is the exercise hard? Because I think that like when you start to overlap it with like strength curve, it just gets really, really muddied insofar as like what you're actually talking about. So, a resistance profile in an exercise, you can just think of as like, where is the implement's strength? And just sort of forget about your own strength rather than thinking about it in tandem with your own strength. So when I say hard, I guess that was a little bit confusing initially. I mean hard in the sense of like nothing to do with you. Where's the implement from a physical perspective insofar as its interaction with you going to be heaviest? And that kind of brings us to a conversation around torque, which is a longer conversation. But I think that the listener probably doesn't need to know everything, about torque to understand that like, a dumbbell lateral raise, as we've mentioned, is harder at the top as compared to the bottom. So I think it's somewhat of an awkward thing to be comparing like, strength profile, how strong we are, to resistance profile, how strong the resistance is against us. But I think it's not untrue to say that a resistance profile just tells us where the implement that we're using is acting most against us. So it's somewhat counterintuitive to be like ignoring the us factor, because we are essentially like, especially with the dumbbell, we're determining how far the dumbbell is away from us. But I think it's helpful just for people to have that framework in their heads before we dive into some of the specific topics about, study interventions and those kinds of things, to remember that when we say resistance profile, we're always referring to resistance, right? We're not referring to us. And so, for me, like learning this stuff initially, it was very helpful to just create a very strong separation of those two things and to look at them as separately as possible. And then only when I was really comfortable with having looked at them as separately as possible, and, only until I felt like I understood them individually, did I feel like it was okay to kind of bring those two things together. So when we talk about the length stuff, right? So the stretch mediated hypertrophy stuff versus the shortened position stuff, we're talking about muscle length, and which is the first topic we just introduced. And muscle length, physiological length, often dictates what our strength is, right? So you could talk about, distance to joints and all that stuff, but length tension, basically how long the muscle is versus how short the muscle is, tells us a lot about where the muscle has a high capacity to produce force and where the muscle has a low capacity to produce force. So as a very, very, very generalized rule, muscles tend to be much stronger when they're more stretched or when they're in their mid to stretch positions versus when they're in their mid to shorten positions. So you could think of it like a rubber band, in that, the more that you stretch the rubber band, the farther it's going to go, kind of a thing. That's, I think, a helpful visual maybe for some people. And the less that you stretch the rubber band before you release it, the less amount of distance it will travel. So muscle length relates to length tension, relates to basically strength profile. So that's one side of things. That's the first half of it, which is, okay, what is the length of the muscle and how much force can the muscle produce as a product of its length, totally separate from the exercise. And then there's, okay, here's the resistance profile over here. That just refers to the resistance and how much the resistance is acting on us. And the combination of those two things is what we get in an exercise. And so when we say short position exercise, we can't just look at what is the length of the muscle or what is the resistance profile. We have to look at both of those two things together, and we have to ask, okay, where in this particular exercise do I find myself experiencing the most amount of resistance? Because you could very well do an exercise that, you're getting into a very, very shortened position of a muscle, but you're still able to do that range of motion, even despite being much stronger at the opposite end of the range, right? So for example, in a very well set up resistance profile preacher curl, right, you're going to be super weak at the top, but if there's some amount of resistance that gets offloaded toward the top of the range, you're going to be able to do that portion of the range despite being weaker there. So I think this segregation of ideas just as a framework is very important, so that we can talk about these things in sort of the different pieces as we go through, some of the research concepts or some of the concepts that maybe you have in mind for the research stuff. So is there anything there that you think might just be totally confusing or sort of muddy for people listening before we dive more into like the combination and application?
From my perspective, I thought that was pretty well said.
Okay. All right, it's pretty good. So I think just for starters, important to contextualize before the application stuff again. This concept of stretch-mediated hypertrophy is basically just, if those of you listening haven't been keeping up with what's floating around the sort of podcast spheres and the social media spheres, is this concept of, okay, if I can get a muscle to a longer length, right, a more stretched position, and I can train it more in that stretched position, even if it's not with the best resistance profile in the world, is that kind of an exercise, is the kind of an exercise that trains that stretched position going to be more beneficial to us in the context of hypertrophy outcomes? Is it going to be more beneficial to us in relationship to the opposite end of the spectrum, where we would just be, training a shorter muscle length? So Ethan earlier had mentioned just within exercise muscle length stuff. So like, in a leg extension, the more stretched position would be the bottom versus the more shortened position would be the top. So there have been studies that have compared that stuff in a way that I think is different from the way that Ethan is going to describe in a second here. But I think that as a whole, my framework in looking at this stuff is a lot maybe different than it used to be, and it's a lot different than I think the way that most people are looking at it. I think a lot of people are looking at it from the perspective of how much output can I get out of this thing in terms of the results that I see. So should I do more stretch position stuff versus short position stuff, because the stretch position stuff just gets me bigger, and a lot of times that's what we've seen, at least in in a little bit more of a nuanced way, which we can get into. I think that the way that I look at this conversation is more along the lines of like just training muscles through their fullest lengths, regardless of what we might perceive the outcome to be, I think ends up being a better overall solution. Not necessarily just from like an orthopedic human standpoint, but also from the perspective of fatigue management and downside mitigation, if you will, right? So everyone kind of knows intuitively, I think, that like doing super heavy leg presses and hack squats and pendulum squats is generally more fatiguing than doing a hard set of leg extensions. But part of that has to do a lot with this conversation of short versus long muscle length, right? Because we wouldn't really be able to lift as much load as we would be able to lift if we weren't exponentially stronger in stretch positions. And as we've talked about with, Tom plenty of times, we are really, really, really much stronger in stretch positions. I think it's a much bigger distinction in terms of force production than most people would assume. And when you get into a machine that has a really, really significantly biased resistance profile, that's when you really start to realize it. But I want to save, some more specific examples for when I think we've dove deeper into the application stuff. So that brings us to you and kind of what, you were texting, late night, Saturday night thoughts. But I want to kind of start out by just asking, when it comes to the short versus long muscle length training, obviously we have to discuss the resistance profile thing along the way. Where does your head kind of go insofar as like the general conversation around it, and where you think it maybe goes wrong, and where you think it maybe has been helpful to people? Because in my view, I think a lot of people tend to see snippets of research that say long muscle length training equals better. And that gets confusing for a lot of people when they're looking at all of these massive people who, are only doing short position stuff with implements that only, are heavy in short positions, because they say, oh, like this dude is huge and he's only doing the short position stuff. What's going on there? So maybe just a little bit of context around your overall perspective, and then we can get into some more specific examples with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at the leg extension is a good example. That happened to be like a study I was looking through last night, was just like comparing the lengthened position, leg extension, shortened position, full range of motion. And that's a big one that people cite to say, look, we got more growth with the subjects training in the lengthened position only compared to, the full range of motion, which may be a little bit counterintuitive. And, in that study, they even mentioned like mechanical work, and that's going to be, basically the amount of weight that you use times the distance that you travel. And that's going to tend to be greater in the full range of motion, just because the distance is so much greater. And then when you only use work, as a proxy for tension, I think a lot of things, can go wrong there. So my thought, really, just resistance profile aside, because I don't even know that it's that relevant when you're talking about doing partial reps to failure, is just looking at, like you said before, the strength profile in terms of where a muscle is going to be strong. If we know that, in this example, the quadriceps are going to be stronger in a more lengthened position than a shortened position, and we know that the primary driver of muscle hypertrophy is mechanical tension, I would just think that would be a huge red flag to say, well, maybe they can just do a whole lot, create a whole lot more tension in that position than they can, in the other two. And the way they tend to standardize these studies is not with like, the same load reps, any kind of like equating in some way for mechanical tension, which I think is very difficult to do.
Mm-hmm.
Because, even if, for example, we were to say, all right, you do the same amount of weight. Well, as you just mentioned, that same amount of weight does not create the same resistance throughout. So doing the same weight at the bottom, of a lateral raise is not the same as the same weight at the top of a lateral raise. And the same will apply to a leg extension, depending on how it's built.
Yeah, and so just a point of clarification there, maybe for people who are having trouble understanding that piece. What Ethan is pointing to is the fact that because of the distance part of the equation, in terms of how far you're holding a weight away from you, if you are doing just the top half of a lateral raise, let's say you could use a 10-pound dumbbell, right? You could use, let's say, maybe a 50-pound dumbbell or a 60-pound dumbbell just in the bottom, let's say 20% of the range, and the force between the two, because of the distance, will be the same in that case. So you're basically saying, like, you can force equate in the top of a range when the dumbbell is much farther from you versus the bottom, because of the distance piece being so different. because the distinction between weight and resistance is what we're talking about, where you can hold the much heavier dumbbell and you could move it a much shorter distance, or you can hold a much lighter dumbbell and you could move it, in a range that's a much greater distance away from you. And those two things would be similar from a force perspective.
Yeah, and it can be sort of confounding, when you're just looking at the weight and then thinking about these topics of strength profile versus resistance profile, because we're already stronger, at the bottom of a lateral raise and a leg extension. But on top of that, you may have a resistance profile that also accentuates that. So
Yeah.
I don't think, it's such an easy thing to just be like, well, if they just use the same weight, in the same reps and, did it lengthen versus shorten or lengthen versus full range, that would necessarily be resistance or torque equated. So it's very difficult to, I think, standardize for tension production. My thought was maybe using like an isokinetic machine and something where you could actually get a measurement of force, at different parts of the range.
Like with a maximum voluntary contraction type of thing.
Yeah, but then you'd have to you'd have to standardize in some way. Like either you would start with the lengthen position and just say, all right, we're going to go to, X, area under the curve as far as like force production. And then we're going to do the same thing, for the shortened position and the full range of motion. Because initially I was like, well, when they're doing these studies, what they do is they'll set, some percentage of 1RM. And then, let's say it's a 12-week study. Every time they're able to like achieve that set and rep scheme, they'll increase the load, and it's based on the 1RM of that range of motion. So
Okay.
it's not like it's standardized across all ranges, and then you have all these other factors coming into play, like the resistance profile, the strength profile. But I think my fundamental point is that the strength profile is not the same from lengthened position to shortened position, and my hypothesis would be that simply like one of the major factors is that you're simply able to create more mechanical tension in the lengthened position than you are doing the other two. And someone might say, well, who cares? Like if it works, it works. And that's kind of how these studies are designed. And I think, for good reason. Like at the end of the day, people want to know the practical application. Like you're comparing on a per set basis, or even like a time basis. So I think really the question that they're answering right now with the research is like, what's more efficient for hypertrophy on a per set or a per minute basis, not necessarily like why is this more hypertrophic. And I think that's a really big distinction. There's, like I've talked about in previous episodes, like there are lots of examples of things that are more potent that don't necessarily make them the best tool for the job all the time. And I'd mentioned previously like that I think it is kind of like a movement from novice, to maturity, or basically along this spectrum, going from thinking like more is better to realizing the nuance of like when to apply more and when to, go with a more specific and more nuanced approach. And I think always, as we move away from ignorance and towards maturity, that it tends to become a more nuanced approach than simply, this is the best, this is the most optimal, this is the strongest, right? Like whenever you hear those things, what's the best exercise? What's the strongest drug? What's the most optimal way to eat, train, what have you? That's always coming from a very, novice and ignorant mindset. And I get the sense we're going to see the same thing here. There's usually some core concepts that we just come back around to, and that like if we look at this long muscle length thing as like totally separate from mechanical tension, the same way we looked at mechanical damage and metabolic stress completely separate from mechanical tension, I think over time we just saw those all come together.
Mm.
And it was like, we certainly don't have a full understanding of those things right now. But I think, as a general consensus, people are leaning more in the direction now that there's a ton of overlap and they're, inseparable to a degree, rather than these are separate mechanisms that occur in practice, very differently. So, with the stretch mediated stuff, there's these studies where like, early on with animals, where it was like you're loading them, all day long, like in a stretch position. And then now, in humans, many of which are calf studies, where you have these extended, stretches, and just this separation between like a stretch and producing torque, like the difference between like what we're thinking of as completely passive and what we're thinking of as active. I think even that's very blurred. Like if you know I think of like DC training, for example. I don't know if you're familiar with like Dante Trudel, but a big thing in
Oh,
that.
yeah. Is that the dog crap guy or whatever?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
in many programs, have had stretches, like loaded stretching in the program. You know, even going. Um, yeah, I don't think any of your listeners will even know this name if I remember it anyway. But like it's been around since sort of like the very very early days of.
Don't underestimate the
Well, I
modern
don't
day
remember it, so
community,
I'm just
bro.
making an excuse.
Fair.
So, but anyway, it's been around forever. Like people have been doing, loaded stretches forever. Um, but what you see is it's just an isometric. It's like, oh, a loaded stretch is the bottom of like, a dumbbell fly. And it's like, well, what's the distinction between a stretch there and an isometric?
Mm,
Because if you relax, your arm rips off. So
mhm.
really you're just holding a weight.
Sure.
And I think again, all these lines start to get blurred, and we're like, oh, this is a stretch. Well, it's like you still have to stop, your joint from just being torn apart. So there's some tension being created there. I'm not so sure that if you took the same beginners and just had them do, 60 to 90 minutes of short position isometrics, the whole time, that they wouldn't grow as well.
Mhm.
So that's kind of the concept I'm trying to get across here is like, producing force, producing torque, like may just be the factor that brings this, all together. And the idea that like you that there's this like there may be some separate mechanisms, just like with metabolic stress, mechanical damage, like there are probably some separate pathways with all of that, but you can't really divorce that in practice from mechanical tension. And I think we're seeing the same thing here, or at least I would just hypothesize that like there's going to be a lot of overlap, and maybe the primary factor is still mechanical tension, not so much that there's symmetrical receptors, or specific connective tissues or what have you that are eliciting some you know separate signaling pathway. I would just pay close attention, like in most other scenarios, to the primary unifying factor, which in this case is mechanical tension.
Yeah, and I think that like the human brain wants to jump to the mystical thing that, is still out there that we don't really just don't understand. And this is the one missing piece that it's going to be. And, all the people that are really struggling to grow right now, like this is going to be the reason why type of thing. So I understand why, much like many other topics, it has had this like explosion in conversation. But I think at the end of the day, it's like, okay, well, if you can do like 20%, if you can use 20% more load in the bottom half of a leg extension and you can do 10 more reps there, probably makes sense that you might get a better, growth response from just doing the bottom versus just doing the top or doing the full range even. So one of the things that I think also would be useful to maybe discuss just briefly is like how you and I maybe apply some of this stuff and like what we actually use it for. For me personally, if I have a matched profile exercise, so, I'm doing an exercise where it's sort of uniformly hard throughout the full range of motion. An
When
example,
when you say hard in this context, the
yeah,
first
yeah,
time,
effort.
yeah, the first time you said hard, what you meant was the resistance acting on you. But in this case, when you say hard, you mean how difficult it feels for you.
Yeah. So assuming I push, good clarification is I push 110% the whole way through, we'll say the weight moves, the same speed roughly through most of the range, right? So like a really well set up leg press, could be an example of this. Like the pendulum squat that we have, the Atlantis one, if I control, the weight down and I shove as hard as I can, the weight moves, at a pretty similar speed throughout the entirety of the range. Which to me, if I'm pushing as hard as I can, it's a challenging weight. Rep speeds generally slow down over the course of like a set. To me, that seems like that's what I would define as like a fairly matched profile. On those exercises, I don't really divide up between variations. So it's not like I'll do, partials at the bottom of a pendulum squat versus partials at the top. But with something like a cable row, for example, what I'll do is if I'm planning on doing 4 or 5 sets of that exercise for the day is I'll do the first maybe 1 or 2 where, I'm doing the full range of motion of the exercise and I'm pausing in the fully shortened position of that exercise to kind of accentuate that portion of the range and the challenge in that portion of the range. And whenever I fail or whenever I deem I've gotten to whatever RAR I feel is appropriate for that set, what I'll do is I'll just stop when I can't get to that same squeezed position. I won't like bang out any sort of partials along with that first variation. And then what I'll do after that is I'll usually bump up the load and 10 to 20% of whatever it ends up being. And I'll just do reps in the more lengthened half of the range, kind of just ignoring that fully shortened position. So, the fully shortened position of the second variation in the cable row will become like, the halfway position or, to where my arm almost gets in line with my body, but probably slightly in front of it, if it's like a horizontal type row. And that's kind of just how I've been applying the stuff insofar as the concept of just like making sure that we sort of get as much out of the exercise as we can in terms of making sure that every portion of the range is loaded appropriate to the strength that we have in that range. And so, with any sort of cable pulling motion, that's probably going to be the case where people have in, a much higher relative amount of difficulty in the short position, regardless of the load, right? So when they're getting back to that full squeeze, it's going to be harder for people to continue to, get to that spot every single rep, and the range is going to drop off every single rep as fatigue sets in. So I think that doing an exercise or rather splitting an exercise like that into multiple, instead of just doing one, 4 sets full range, is a good way to kind of apply this kind of thinking in terms of a way that's more concrete. So I know that you do some kinds of things that are similar to that, but if you could expand on what I just kind of was talking about and how you apply it.
Yep. So coming back to those terms, resistance profile and strength profile, the idea here, with a match profile is that the resistance profile most closely resembles your strength profile. It's hard where you're strong and it's easier where you're weaker. I think you can make a case that even with like a matched profile, that maybe you could still create a little bit more tension if you only did the lengthened position. But I think those two are going to converge a lot more, where again, if, we just did like a dumbbell lateral raise and we did the full range of motion, because the, resistance profile is so different, so sort of it's really the inverse, in this case of your strength profile. That's going to be an exercise where you probably benefit a lot, from either, picking a better resistance profile or, maybe doing some partials. So exercises like that, I'm going to be more likely, to do partials in. And to your point, oftentimes that's pulling exercises. And it's not uncommon for me, to use a cable or a machine. And if it doesn't have a good profile, to also do lengthened partials there. So some more things to think about. I think like something like pressing, whether that be like squatting or whether that be like, bench pressing, dumbbell pressing, what have you, these are going to naturally be profiles that are a little bit more matched. than, like the pulling with free weights, where, it's hardest when you're in a lengthened position and stronger, and it drops off towards the top. And sometimes in this position, in these exercises, like you'll see people put bands and chains, and it actually flips around where, because I don't know if we want to, get into the whole like moment arm thing and torque again, but let's just say that like as you get to the what would be a short position, or the top in this case of these pressing exercises, you're getting stronger. Like even though you're moving into a physiological short position for the muscle, there's multiple joints moving at once, and the position of the load relative to those joints is changing. So, again, with a squat or a bench press, it would be easier to do reps at the top than it would be to do, reps at the bottom, even though we just said, like, yeah, from a strength or from a muscle perspective, you would be shorter in those positions. So with those type of like free weight pressing, squatting type exercises, those are ones where I don't tend to do partials, because I think, we're pretty much, close enough. If anything, you could make it a little bit harder at the top position of those. But I'll just give you some examples here, muscle by muscle. For me, it really depends also on what machines, I'm using. And because I'm, tend to be a stickler for that, and I train, under the same conditions most of the time, I tend to have pretty good machines. So there's, only a few scenarios where, I have to find other ways, to bias the positions where I'm stronger. So yeah, for calves, I do seated calf raises on the Kaiser machine. And you always laugh when I do this, but on the Kaiser machine, which uses pneumatic or air resistance, I'm able to change the resistance during the set. So I literally will just add resistance as I go through the eccentric, and lower resistance as I go through the concentric, which will also match that profile of being stronger, lengthened, and weaker short.
I just love for context when you're doing something that's like super odd to other people, because there are like just average people, who are at just normal clients, like walking around our gym, and you'll just be you'll be in the corner just for like 5 straight minutes, just
Yeah,
pressurizing the
I mean, to give you an idea of how different the strength is, like in the lengthened position. So when I'm most dorsiflexed, um, I did it yesterday, and I was like 650 on the seated calf raise, and in the bottom, and there's also a time component, so it's not exactly perfect, but by the time I get to the bottom, maybe I'm 300 or so, just to guess, but it's like half,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So there's a really big difference between how strong you are there. And if you watch, for example, Ronnie Coleman and Jay Cutler do seated calf raises, they just do. Ronnie mostly just does the bottom, and he just bounces, in the bottom.
Mhm.
And Jay does like 2 reps in the bottom, and then he like explodes through the top. So
Yeah,
he uses, momentum to get himself to the top position. But then like every other calf exercise he just does shortened partials.
interesting.
So it's like, oh, you got that, maybe there's something else there, but it's like that one makes sense. When I see the lengthen, and yeah, the other thing I think of is the other calf exercises he does are knee extended. So they're already starting from, a little bit more lengthened bias. But I thought it was interesting, just those two guys, uh, they both use a lot of momentum, a lot of kind of like bouncing, in the seated calf raises, which, you can kind of make an argument against from like, maybe a stretch reflex standpoint. But the point is they spend a lot of time in the bottom. And then if they go to the top, it's only through just a ton of, momentum, which means that a lot of that work's still being done at the bottom.
What's an interesting point I've been thinking about recently that relates to this is, um, I would be very interested to see a study comparing, well, there very well may be studies with this. I don't know about in trained people, but comparing seated calf raise to like standing hack squat calf raise, we'll say. Because those are the options that a lot of people choose. They'll choose like the machine, at a commercial gym, the one with the pads that you kind of just get under. And I would be willing to bet, and what most people would say is the response from the more stretched exercise would be better. But I would be willing to bet that the seated calf raise, especially if you were doing lengthened partials, would outperform the hack squat calf raise, specifically because you don't have the restraint on the standing hack calf raise unless you use something like a strap. Like, you don't have that anchor to basically hold you into position in that lengthened position. And so I think another really interesting piece to this whole like resistance profile, strength curve, stretch mediated puzzle is like how much of an anchor do you have to oppose the forces, the high degrees of forces that you're creating in the length of position. And so I think that's a super interesting piece between, a short position exercise that has that direct restraint support versus a lengthened position that doesn't. I'd be much more willing to go with the the seated calf in this example as opposed to the standing, if I only had to actually pick one for a variety of those reasons. And that is what you see a lot of times happening with the standing hack squat type thing. Is like that old school bodybuilding thing where what you're describing, or in terms of what I'm visualizing, it's like people will kind of get, to like a halfway point, and then they do that jut thing from like the middle up. And I think you originally mentioned this to me like 3 years ago or something, and I had like no idea what you were talking about. You were like, yeah, people do calf raises as like two different reps. Basically, there's the first, which is the bottom, and the second, which is like people supinate and like, fly up out of the top. So I think that's a really another interesting bit to this is you can have all of the stretch mediated, or you can have all the stretch position stuff perfect, and you can even have a resistance profile that maybe is perfect in tandem with that. But then if you don't have an anchor to basically hold you where you want to be in order to create that force, it's pretty irrelevant anyway, if that makes sense.
So why do you think they're doing like the 1.5 reps there?
On the seated or
The standing.
I think they're doing the 1.5 reps there just because of the uh the strength profile of the gastroc. Number one, just because you're probably maybe more than 50% stronger in the bottom half than the top half, probably more. But I think another piece is that people do that because if you think about, and this may be difficult for some people to visualize, but like if you picture the full range of a calf raise and kind of the arc that the foot moves. So, for people watching, this being the platform, this is kind of like where you move to. You have a really good ability in this bottom half to actually push into this platform, right? So maybe some of it is off here, but you still have the ball of your foot on. And once you get to this point where you're basically, relative to the platform, your foot is parallel to the platform, you start to need to go up on your toes, and you start to need to extend all of these guys. So the direction of shove is like you're almost sort of shoving backward now instead of shoving directly downward. And when you're shoving backward, you need something else that pushes you forward, right, as a restraint. So maybe you can simplify that for anyone listening in terms of like, because I wouldn't really know how to describe that audibly differently. Basically, just you have a much better ability to shove into the platform in the bottom and the middle, and you need something else to shove against in the top, where the direction of your foot, the intent of your foot, in terms of where it's trying to move, is very different. So you have the whole strength profile thing, but your mechanics relative to the foot plate go to shit in the top half. So I think people like to get to that point where they're really mechanically strong and then just bounce out of that. But a lot of times, like in the seated calf that we have, like there's no need to do that because the platform arcs with your foot.
Yeah, I'm on the. I got all that. That makes
Yeah.
sense. Like the strength profile thing, totally understood, and then the restraint. So what confused me, I think the first time, at least the way that I heard it, is this arc that you're describing. The first part of the arc kind of being more vertical, and the next part of the arc being more horizontal. It sounded like the first time, people will listen to this back, and I don't have that opportunity in real time. But the way I heard it the first time was that in the knee extended standing version, that you didn't have good restraint for the bottom. And when you said it this time, it fit more in line with what I was thinking, which is that you didn't have good restraint for the top, and the top being the forward and back. And I'm thinking that forward and back would be like, putting a seatbelt around the machine, shoving back into the seatbelt so that you could have more restraint in that forward to back horizontal vector as you get to the top. But what you were saying is there's good restraint at the bottom, and that's why people would do partials and then use momentum to get to the top.
So I would say I would say you would in the standing hack calf raise, there would be poor restraint for the whole thing, but the necessity for restraint is greater toward the top. If that makes sense.
So where would you want the restraint to be, like at the bottom? Like what are we missing at the bottom?
So it would depend on how much the person could dorsiflex. Because if the person can dorsiflex to a really acute angle, then you have a sort of like backward direction. But
Yeah.
either way, you're just going to want it around the back of your knee, because there's no more viable direction that you would want to oppose that force, even as it were sort of swinging. So if you could make a calf machine that somehow had an adjustable pad that you just would shove into, that would be people and people don't. This makes it sound so ridiculous to some people, but like the difference that it makes is like it feels like a different exercise.
Well, yeah. So like the calf raise that I use at my third gym that I train at now is like it's the Cybex one where the foot pad arcs. Like you and I have used this.
Yeah,
So you end up kind of going over the top of it. And if
yeah.
you move the seat really far forward and it's really just pressing on you crazy hard in the lengthened position, by the time you get to the short position, you end up being in a pretty good spot to kind of arc over the top.
Mm-hmm.
Is what you're saying with the seated calf raise, that the foot plate oftentimes is moving, or the foot plate often has like just a better arc, sort of more in line with your foot mechanics?
So the one that we have arcs with our foot a little bit, the Kaiser one, but a lot of the seated calf raises that I've used, just the plate loaded ones, they're not substantially better than the foot plates on a standing hack calf raise, but a lot of them do dip a little bit, like they're a little bit rounded. I think Tom has one that's a little bit rounded too, that you can kind of articulate over a little bit so that you don't end up smushing your toes. So that would be the first thing. The other thing would be that a lot of people's toes naturally dip over the platform because it's narrow. So like if you could just cut off your toes in a calf raise, I'd be okay with that. And I think that's maybe something that contributes. But the biggest difference is just where you have that ability to shove, being the pad down through your knees on the seated calf. You're much more locked in that way, even if you go through a bigger arc. I find that like as long as you have the pad locked down onto the top of your quads on the seated calf, you don't need a specific direction that's more precise than the pad on the quads, in the same way that you wouldn't something behind your knees in the standing calf. But yeah, I think it's super interesting to me too, how these things overlap with like sensations of pain and discomfort. Because I've had a couple people, I mean, Kyle, who was, on the podcast a couple weeks ago, he for the longest time, like just didn't have any comfort with the standing variation in his foot until I showed him how to restrain the back of his knee. And so I think I definitely used to be in a place that was like, I need to know why, this pain disappeared. And now I'm okay with just being like, don't know why, but no pain equals better, probably. So, okay, cool. So that was a good overarching, I think, discussion that got more practical. Is there anything along there that we missed, do you think?
I mean, I was definitely going to go into that restraint concept as well, because
Yeah.
it shows up in a lot of places for me with making the profile better.
Let's just say anchor from now on.
I couldn't remember what you're called. I really tried to remember it.
It's
Um,
okay.
so just moving on from the calves, it's like, a good anchor for seated leg curl and leg extension ends up being the seat belt. For me, that helps immensely as far as like making the profile better, where again, a good profile being easy where I'm weakest. I find, when I use that on the seated leg curl and leg extension, that I fail where I want to fail, which is that, I can barely eke out the last rep right into that final inch of the shortened position. And then maybe, I'll get another quarter rep, or so, if anything, at the bottom. And that we still have machines that have good resistance profiles. So it's not like the restraint is, totally overcoming that on a bad machine, but it helps immensely. Um, I think even on a leg press, just learning to really create a just tremendous amount of stiffness and pressure in your body is such an important factor when it comes to getting output on a leg press. I think it comes down more to being able to stiffen the rest of your body and use the restraints, of the back pad and of the handle than anything else. And you'll see, whether you're really fatigued or whether you're not good at this. Like when you watch people that are great at a leg press, there doesn't tend to be a lot as much like starting and stopping and as much just like wiggling. It's kind of like you lock in and you're just able, when you're in a good machine, you're able to pretty much bang out the whole set with, one or two stops, maybe, like, to get to absolute failure, versus like, 3 reps stop, 2 reps stop. So certainly when I watch other people leg press, especially in commercial gyms, one of the biggest things I notice is just their inability, to create stiffness elsewhere to be able to, produce high output. As
On
we move,
that
yeah,
point though, just before you move on, I think it's a really useful point for people to hear, because I think the common narrative around leg press is like, oh, if you get down on a leg press, unlike in a squat, where you have to stabilize the bar, the leg press just does the work for you. Like, I hear so many people say that, and that same line of thinking is the same line of thinking that not only fucks people up, I think, in a leg press, but also just leads to tremendously lower amounts of output, like you were saying. So I think that, if anything, these more, anchored, restrained exercises force us in some ways to be more cognizant of those types of things, because you start to be able to actually observe, like, okay, when do I have this tremendous energy leak? And when do I really feel like I'm able to push directly into the platform? Because I think a lot of people see a back pad and a seat and they just think easier. And so they pay less mind to it. And as a product of paying less mind to it, their output goes down, and or it just doesn't feel like the same as a squat feels. And so, people then, in this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy type of a way, make the false conclusion that, oh, there's no need to really pay attention to this kind of stuff on a leg press. So that's a really good caveat there.
yeah, I think the first time people really create that amount of stiffness, like, of course, their blood pressure goes through the roof. They might be dizzy when they come out. It's very fatiguing at first, and you might get less reps. But you can quickly learn to tolerate that, and then the output goes through the roof. Um, when it comes to pulling exercises, and I'll get some videos of this for you, like in the new gym that I'm training at. But like the other day, I was doing a lat pull down, and in a lot of the old school gyms, you'll see uh, like back pads just laying around. Like, picture the back of a leg extension where it's like maybe a really long back pad, and some people are, you know too short, or whatever, and they're doing maybe a seated leg curl, and they need to bring the seat further forward, but it doesn't go further forward, so they just put another back pad behind it. Like at our gym, we might use like an RX pad, but a lot of these old school gyms just have like these these extra pads laying around. And I'll use those sometimes as like a chest restraint. So like I set one up the other day where I use the knee pad as kind of like a fulcrum for this chest pad, where I was able to, like, at the top of the motion in the lengthen position, have the chest pad oppose me pretty well there. But as I, lean back slightly, the fulcrum would anchor the chest pad back, and I was still able to push into it, which, like, I just don't think you could do, on a normal lat pull down. But this machine was just such that it worked really well for that. And
Yeah, that's super interesting.
being able to push into that chest pad at the bottom for this particular machine, which had a great path of motion but a poor profile, really helped.
Mhm. Yeah,
Uh,
and I would prefer that 10 out of 10 times is a good path of motion and a shit profile, because you can always work around a shit profile.
exactly, exactly. Um, the same applies for now biceps and triceps. And I counted last time I was at the gym I was just describing, and there was about 30 bicep machines and 30 tricep machines, like machines, like picture a preacher curl machine, like on one floor there was literally 30 of each.
Mhm.
um and for myself, none of them are better than just using uh a cable, a functional trainer,
Yeah.
which they don't have at this gym, ironically. So I end up doing arms, with the prime functional trainer at Hype. And that allows, to your point a second ago, that allows me to create the exact like path of motion that I want, which is really important. But then also, it's not too hard for me to set up the profile I want either. So I can create a profile that drops off pretty significantly into the short position for both my like shoulder flex and shoulder extended bicep and tricep exercises. And then that restraint of, having something to shove into backwards for the curl and something to shove into, forwards for the tricep extension, just makes such a ridiculous difference as far as output.
Mhm.
And as far as the whole like volume conversation, I think that can really, really lend itself to being, more efficient and productive, with those sets. And probably, as we've discussed, just lead to needing a whole lot less sets. Like certainly, um, just looking at videos of other bodybuilders train, um, you do I do perceive that there's like a lot of inefficiency with the way they're doing things, so they have to do just a inordinate amount of sets to make up for that. And there's can certainly be arguments, I think, made both ways for just like how far do you train from failure versus how many sets you do. But I think at the end of the day, like, it'd be hard to make an argument for not having a path of motion that match the muscle you were trying to train and the way that joint moves on your body. And also just having a profile that was appropriate as well. I think those would be hard things to argue against. So once you have those things set in place, then you can start to look at this interaction between effort and and sets in regards to like what you want your total volume to look like.
Yeah, and I also wondered a lot like why people are so intuitively anti-cable in some ways, which sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but people perceive like cables to somehow make you weaker. And I think a big part of that is the fact that in the same way it's a benefit that we can adjust the force direction and profile in any way that we want. It's also a drawback in that if you don't really know what you're looking for or what you're trying to do, you could be doing any number of 10 different things with the same perceived setup, right? So I do understand that a lot of that comes from I just think like a lack of knowledge around how to use the tool, if that makes sense. Which is why, like a lot of bodybuilders just prefer to just get on a machine and just like go to town. And even if it's, the profile sucks, or the path of motion loading their elbows sucks, it's like at least they have something to push into so that their elbow can be loaded more. Whereas with the cable, it's like, you have to be a little bit more specific about how you set that up. So it makes sense to me why people's output can be so low with cables. But I just think that in general too, once you kind of understand some basic concepts, it's like very, very easy to kind of set certain things up once you know what to feel and look for. Even with the arm restraint stuff, which naturally feels a little bit weirder to people, just to begin with. I've seen like a lot of people start to really like the triceps restraint stuff. And so I'm hoping that more and more people will hop on the anchoring bandwagon as time goes on here, and as people's eyes are open to the truth, as yours have been. Because I think that the anchorage conversation plays so much into all the other stuff that we're talking about, like we said, and it really, really tremendously influences like not only just your actual output, but your perception of like, how does this thing feel throughout all of the range? Because there are certain exercises that when they don't have that amount of restraint just feel either really different from what your expectations are, like your limiters in the exercise are your shoulder instead of your elbow, or are your spinal erectors instead of your rowing tissues. I think that it plays so much more into this whole conversation that people realize, there's just such an overlap. If it's like on one hand we're talking about profile, on another we're talking about strength, on another we're talking about path of motion, what needs to be talked about in tandem with all of those things is the anchorage conversation, because none of it will matter if you don't have that ability to actually keep your bones in the positions that you want them to be kept in.
Yeah,
So
and a lot of the way people have historically used cables end up being the opposite of what we want from a resistance profile standpoint, where they're just they face the machine and do cable curls. Oftentimes it's going to be harder at the top. Maybe they would have been better off using dumbbells in the first place. When they hook it up to the cable, they generally use a straight bar. And again, maybe the dumbbells would have felt more comfortable than that as well. Triceps, again, face the machine. Now, not only, is the profile potentially not great, especially when they're using the rope, or the straight bar, but also now you have to manage what's happening at the shoulder. So for all those reasons, like, doing a dumbbell curl and, dumbbell skull crusher might actually be, more appropriate in those conditions.
yeah.
Doesn't make it a better tool. It's just how you managed the other tool.
Yeah, it's hard to communicate that in a way that doesn't sound like snobby and pretentious, like, oh, you don't know how to use this thing, which is why you don't like it. But in a lot of ways, like, that to me is what it has come down to. So I think that's probably a good place to wrap up, unless you had any sort of closing thoughts. We can continue this discussion or a variation of it, of course, in the future, but anything else?
It was good.
All right. Fantastic, sir.